All right, then welcome back for this third panel of our conference today, which we have entitled Alternative Forms of Political Diaspora Engagement. So diasporas have long played a crucial role in shaping political movements from exile governments to transnational activism. Traditionally, engagement has been framed through lobbying, remittances, or electoral participation. This is what we've talked about this morning. But today we are witnessing also a shift, one driven by creativity, technology, and also new forms of solidarity. And rather than calling these approaches actually alternative, which suggests a deviation from the norm, we might also think of them as innovative approaches, transforming what political engagement looks like. Social media has enabled dispersed communities to mobilize in real time, while art, music, and storytelling have created new avenues for advocacy and identity formation. So this panel will explore how diasporic actors use these tools, not just to influence politics back home, but also to redefine political belonging itself. So how do these innovations reshape power and participation? And what are new possibilities and challenges do they bring along? So I'm excited to dive into these questions with our four incredible speakers. The first speaker will be Houda Mzioudet. So Houda is with us over Zoom. She is a University of Toronto alumni and a freelance researcher on Tunisian and Libyan affairs, focusing mainly on transnational justice, post-conflict Libyan transition, minority and by diaspora groups of North Africa, and the post-Arab Spring democratic transition. So today, Houda will be discussing the question of liminality, resistance, and active engagement in the case of the Libyan diaspora. Also with us, and she will be the second speaker in this panel, is Özlem Belçim Galip. She is a research fellow at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. She holds a PhD in Exeter, and having studied Kurdish artistic and literary narratives in Turkish Kurdistan and its European diaspora. Her research interests are new social movements, Kurdish-related research from gender and anthropological perspectives, aesthetic and cultural practices, and intellectual activity, always with a gendered lens. And she is particularly interested in visual and material culture, urban, digital, and sensory ethnography. And her presentation today will focus on the intellectual and cultural production of the Kurdish diaspora in Europe. Third speaker in this panel is Ruba Totah. She is a researcher in anthropology and social history, employing grounded methodologies to explore complex cultural dynamics. Her dissertation, Cultural Transnationalism and the Arab Uprising, Migration Artists from Syria to Europe, introduces new innovative conceptual frameworks, fostering fresh discourse on migration, transculturalism, gender, religion, and class. Her research delves into transnationalism and the intercultural and cross-cultural dimension of performing arts, blending anthropological and also philosophical perspectives with cultural criticism theory. So Ruba will talk to us today about the Palestinian and Syrian diaspora communities in mainly Germany and their engagement with performing arts. And last but not least, we have with us also Dima Saber. She is a researcher and writer on media depictions of conflict and on the role of archival records and identity building processes, focusing primarily on the work of political activists in post-revolution and conflict countries such as Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, and Yemen, and also Palestine. She was until late 2022 a reader in media and cultural studies and an associate director for external funding and research development at the Birmingham Center for Media and Cultural Research. And she currently holds the position of Chief Program Officer at Meedan, leading the organization's community impact programs and providing technology, media literacy training, and capacity building supports to independent media organizations and human rights activists in over 45 countries across Asia Pacific. As I said, I would like to open this panel with Houda's contribution. So Houda is with us over Zoom. Houda, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear very well.
Okay, so then I leave the floor to you for about 15 minutes, if that's fine with you.
Sure. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you for CAREP and Ari for organizing this wonderful panel. My presentation is titled Libyan Diaspora and Transition, Liminality, Resistance, and Active Engagement. Well, in this presentation, I will be briefly talking about the nature of Libyan diaspora population, which I can describe as living in a limbo situation. They're at home, but they're still strangers in their host countries. A large section of the Libyan diaspora is exiled. Very few of them are they are considered as refugees, except in a few countries. Others were temporary and permanent residents and tourists and transients in other countries such as Turkey, for example, and Malta. And another section are also exiled in different countries around the world. The Libyan diaspora is very dynamic one, but it has also unfortunately been very marginalized in the research realm. To tackle this marginalization, there has been a lot of work, to tap into the enormous talent of the Libyan diaspora. Historically speaking, Libyans have known exile since before, Gaddafi's coup in 1969, actually even before the independence of Libya from Italy in 1951. And this is how Libyan nationalism was developed, against, first of all, Italian colonization, and then against, the rule of the first King Idris I, who was the ruler of Libya between 1951 and 1969, and eventually against the Gaddafi regime in 2011, following his coup in 1969. So there was a very dramatic political change that led to the exile of the new Libyan nations, and that shaped, the political, social, and cultural elites. The exile, included neighboring countries such as Egypt, but also Western countries, in particular the UK and the US, which housed some of the largest Libyan diaspora population. Italian scholar Alice Aluni developed a thesis on the history of Libyan diaspora population in Western Europe and North America, focused on the migratory flows of Libyans before and after 2011, the role of the newly formed diaspora in the nation building of a political body. So, next, I will be discussing briefly how the Libyan diaspora is caught between a rock and a hard place, and what a diaspora means, especially in light of how this diaspora has been engaged in the homeland, and tied with their notions of return and belonging. This is also part of how their exile was linked to the violent repression of the regime, and has witnessed, the fleeing of many thousands of Libyans, mainly after 2011 of Gaddafi loyalist neighboring Tunisia. So, but also how the Libyan revolution also saw the return of those Libyans who went into exile since 1969. So both, Libyan dissidents and Libyan loyalists have known exile after 2011 revolution in Libya. Dana Moss, who's a sociologist at the University of Notre Dame in the US, has developed research work on Libyan diaspora, analyzing the political mobilization of the diaspora. In the US in particular, looking at the political dissidents in certain areas, in certain states, such as in Kentucky, but also in Southern California, where there is a sizable Libyan community living there. Mostly, they are anti-Gaddafi dissidents who fled Libya, especially in the late 1970s. Also, the Libyan diaspora has adopted a more, let's say, religious outlook, in particular with the Islamists in the UK who mobilized, like-minded Libyan Islamists, to overthrow the Gaddafi regime, and they were looking for a way to mobilize other diaspora, especially in North America. Pergetter stated that the Libyan students in the 70s were attracted to the ideology of the Ikhwan, of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is how they formed, these Islamist or religious ideological exiled communities, whether in the US or the UK. And they have to refer to themselves as the Libyan Islamic group, or Jama'a Islamiyya Libya. in post-2011 Libyan diaspora, there is this dynamic of what I would describe as rooted uprootedness, which is some kind of circular movement for Libyan diaspora of going back and forth to the same point of departure. And that's something that a lot of Libyans who were anti-Gaddafi witnessed when they came back to Libya after the fall of the Gaddafi regime, and then they had to return after, the civil war, the first civil war in 2014, and the takeover also by General Khalif Haftar in 2019. And so they have there is this constant, going back and forth between the country of exile and the homeland. Next, I will also be looking at the alternative mobilization of exiled Libyans, with the return of exiled Libyans marking a turning point in the Libyan revolution, where those exiled communities engaged in the conflict became more prominent. They moved away from the transnational repression that they suffered under the Gaddafi regime to being actively mobilized and challenging the oppressive regime. And this category of Libyan community abroad, they actually defined the post-Gaddafi Libyan transition and their active role within this transition. Most of them, they were mobilizing online, and this can be seen in their active participation of young Libyans in the UK, Germany, Ireland, North America, and using the power of new technologies and effecting significant change in the social and political sphere in Libya, as well as across diaspora. They were aware of how new media such as blogs, podcasts, and social media channels such as YouTube and Facebook played a pivotal role in highlighting the faces of post-Gaddafi reinvigorated Libyan political and social sphere. Actually, Libyans were also being socialized and empowered to these new forms of mobilization by trying and to enact a new form of activism that included reinventing their Libyan identity abroad and their Libyan culture, and by being engaged in exiled civil society activism, whether in cities like Manchester, which hosts the largest Libyan diaspora in any European city, or even in the US. Next up is this is a picture of the most prolific Libyan British writer, Hisham Matar, who's award-winning biographical novel, The Return, definitely represents what the issue of diaspora, exile, loss, and memory has Libyan been grappling with since Gaddafi's coup in 1969. Hisham Matar has featured in a very popular Libyan podcast called the Damira podcast, which is also based in London in the UK. And this podcast, described itself as being made for people and by people who care about truth, justice, human rights in Libya, and where matters about Libya are something that brings Libyan together. On the art and music and artistic talent, there music scene, singers, Amazigh singers, emerged after 2011 to counter the marginalization of Libyan Amazigh during the Gaddafi regime. One of these singers is Dania Ben Sassi, whose Libyan father has escaped to Serbia, at the time former Yugoslavia, because of the repression of his community from his city of Zawara. And she's also she's also her mother is Serbian, so being this mixed race, Libyan singer, Libyan Serbian singer, made Dania Ben Sassi become, in some ways, the voice of the Libyan revolution through her singing songs about Amazigh revivalism after the 2011 the resistance of her community to cultural assimilation. And the majority of her songs actually were written by her father, who was also her manager. And she was clearly an activist in trying to influence the musical scene in Libya after 2011 by making demands for the Libyan, for the Amazigh language to be recognized in the Libyan constitution, and for Libyan Amazigh to try and become the pride of proud of their Libyan Amazigh identity. In also one of also I could call him a cultural icon of the Libyan music scene is singer Ahmed Fakroun, who also sought exile in the late 70s because of the regime's repression, but also because of the international isolation that Libya has known since early 80s and until the early 2000s because of Gaddafi's regime. At the time, accusation of harboring or committing terrorist activities around the world. So Ahmed Fakroun, he became in some ways the pioneer of modern Arabic world music, and he was very popular in France, but also in the UK, where he founded actually his first band when he was 17 years old, when he was studying music in London. And incidentally, Hisham Matar, who before becoming a prominent novelist, he actually started as writing music, and he was very influenced by Ahmed Fakroun's, music. But he realized that later that he wasn't very good enough with music. But just to show you that, Ahmed Fakroun, he was, as an exiled singer, he was also engaged into this in talking about how Libyan nationalism, affected him in writing these committed songs. Next, also one of the most popular Libyan opponent to Gaddafi is Libyan satirist Hassan Himish, who also went into exile in the mid-1970s from his town of Benghazi to northern England, where he married an English woman, and he witnessed, one of the most atrocious episodes of transnational repression of Gaddafi's regime, especially in 1984, when Libyan students were protesting in front of the Libyan embassy in London, and Libyan staff from the embassy started shooting at them, killing in the process a British officer, Yvonne Fletcher, and so and he became a cartoonist, drawing very scathing pictures of cartoons of especially of Gaddafi, someone who she considered as having destroyed, Libya, Libyan cultural scene. And after the revolution, he was very, very critical of the post-Gaddafi Libyan politicians, some of whom they were his own friends, when they were part of the Libyan National, the Libyan National Front, the National Front for the Salvation of Libya, that was set up by one politician who was a Libyan dissident, Mgariev, back in the early 1980s. So his satire was in some kind of double-edged sword that shows how Himish was able to, to express, this kind of, alternative, innovative mobilization against the Gaddafi regime while being in exile. Also, one of the other podcasts, that has voiced that worked on transitional justice in Libya, but also on bringing truth and justice to Libyans, is the Lawyers for Justice in Libya. And they have a podcast called Libya Matters, in which Libyan lawyers, but also researchers, discuss different issues regarding, post-Gaddafi transitional justice. So this podcast, or this organization, has taken up the role of condemning, the extrajudicial, for example, assassinations that happened in 2019, for example, in whether in Eastern or Western Libya, of human rights activists such as Hanan al-Barasi in November 2020. They also called for the UN and other human rights organization to be responsible to investigate the murder and the perpetrators, and bring the perpetrators to justice. They also published a Universal Political Review with fact sheets on human rights state in Libya. The transnational political activism of Libya also had resonance here in North America, with Libyan American support on the rule of law and democracy in trying to bring in to bring in democracy and some civic state in Libya. And some of for them, the only way to do that was to with lobbying, by trying to end the Libyan conflict, to lobby the US Congress to bring perpetrators of human atrocities, human rights abuses, especially with Khalifa Haftar in 2019. And they were in some ways working as a focal point between them and the Libyan political actors, especially the GNA in particular. Yeah, and that's about it. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you, Houda. If you don't mind, we listen first to the other presentations and take the questions afterwards, if that's okay with you.
Sure, yes.
Cheers. So then next with us would be Özlem. So I'll leave you the floor.
And change the slides to... Oh, it's here. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I thought maybe they were waiting for me. Maybe I should just... Actually, I mean, now if you have high expectations from my slides, actually, you shouldn't be, because there's just a few visuals. I mean, I like visuals. So basically, first of all, thank you so much, Isabel, because you're the only person I have been talking to about the whole CAREP crew, for organizing this conference, and also particularly inviting me, because it's interesting to have me, because I'm not working on Arab diaspora. But I can see the point, and I'm very happy to see that point, because this has been something that Kurds have been suffering quite a lot, actually, especially in France, in Belgium, because I interviewed many women. They all, I don't want to say complain about, maybe they resent about being overshadowed by women, migrant women from Maghreb countries like Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, etc., because they always say they have strong organizations. The transnational politics or lobbying. I mean, they get the funding. I'm gonna be very, very straightforward about this. And then French or Belgian authorities, institutions don't want to see us, because they see us as temporary, because we're here, we're a refugee, we're gonna be here for a few years, and when there is peace in our country, we'll go back. Whereas France and Belgium has some sort of very long history, colonial ties with these countries, and they have to deal with these communities. So they don't have time or money for Kurdish people. So that was mainly what I gathered from Belgium and France. Today, I will have just 4 images from 4 countries, whereas in this Marie Curie project that I started in 2018, I had France, Germany, Sweden, and the UK. Back then, UK was the EU. It's interesting. It's not any longer. And actually, I like telling the story behind this project because I always come up with an idea. But of course, these ideas, they don't come up immediately. I mean, they are just kind of accumulation of long thinking and maybe, I don't know, long maybe readings, etc., and observations. I think it was in 2017, I was in a public library in Brighton, in England, and I was just going through all these Western, I guess British, or maybe New York Times, I can't remember specifically, all these Kurdish women fighters images that all Western powers were very proud of. They were, I don't know, like Kurds were very proud of. But I was feeling very bad about not being very proud of them, actually, because I was thinking, it's some sort of diminishing Kurdish women's agency at the same time, because I was so fed up with being considered as political activist or fighter. You know, this is nice. Yes, this is power, empowerment, but this is again very militarized way of thinking migrant women or Middle Eastern women in the first place. And I mean, yes, we like talking about politics, diaspora politics, but don't you think that it's a bit marginalizing at the same time? And I feel like I'm very marginalizing Kurdish women at the same time while making this talk, because I will never, ever talk about their art, or I will never make textual analysis or artistic analysis. I will just talk about their identity. So their identity politics actually is also overshadowing their productions, which is so it's at the dilemma at the same time. And I feel very guilty. I feel very bad about it. I guess there is time for that, I feel like. So maybe 10 years later, someone else will come here and they will specifically pick Zehra Dogan, for instance. She's very inspirational artist, but we hardly talk about her art. We talk about how she came to Europe, how she exhibit, where she gets funding, from where she gets, you know, support, etc. But, you know, we hardly mention her works. Anyway, that's so when I was going through that newspaper, I just realized actually there are so many women like me, like researchers, or I don't know, teachers and artists. I mean, I had friends all over Europe. Why nobody writes about them? So this is the idea how it started, because no, I'm listening to you, Isabel, but it doesn't work. Yeah. So what I mean, I'm sure like none of you is Kurdish, but I'm sure, you know, you have been exposed to those images. So when we look at the current scholarship, mostly Kurdish women are kind of identified with forced migration, displacement, wars, conflicts, honor killings, you know, patriarchal operation. She was killed in London. It was all over the news because there was a negligence of British authorities, because she reported to police that she was scared of being killed by her father and uncle, but the police forces haven't done anything about it. So that's why it was all over the news. But so for me, this is victimhood, this is agency maybe, but for me, these both of them were victimhood, because we're again, you know, we don't know her name, we don't have her background, very exotic. She's beautiful, she's with a gun, etc. So for me, both of them were kind of typical cliche portrayals of victimhood. Or we had this image, like political activists at the same time. I mean, maybe I sound a bit aggressive because this how I have been identified, you know, all the time whenever I meet someone outside, even with each other. So anyway, that's why I came up with this research. And to be honest, I just had a few people in my mind before I started this project, and I was overwhelmed with the number of Kurdish women dealing with all types of artistic stuff. So I didn't limit myself with just like certain art categories, but I tried to stay away from political activists or lawyers, etc., because there are many of them. But I can basically say, I can make very bold statements just at the beginning of my speech. France and Belgium they were the worst ones. You will meet lots of lawyers, political activists, they're all over. And it's actually very misleading because it looks like they're very visible at the same time they're not, because they're just doing certain type of so for example, even, of course, there are so many reasons for that. Their parents in the first place, they want their kid to be lawyer, maybe not, maybe doctor, but lawyer rather than artist, because artists, they can't make their living, plus it's too niche, etc. So basically that's the case, but I don't think just the parents are to blame. There are a bunch of reasons for that, actually. So basically in Belgium and in France, politically Kurds are very active. I mean, Belgium, there are so many Kurdish satellite channels that I have to go all my life. And in France, we have Paris Kurdish Institute, we have Ahmet Kaya Cultural Center. Where are the artists? None. When you ask the question, when you ask them why, of course, there are so many reasons. I will just have one case study from France that might give you some idea. Unfortunately, I have to be very brief. That's very annoying because as it became a book, the first page was the cover of my book from one of the artists that I interviewed. She's really good. I wish I had the chance to give you the 40 women that I interviewed. I mean, all of them were source of inspiration to me. So first, I'm just going to talk a few things about Rojda. But before that, I'm not going to get into Kurdish diaspora. It's a long story, but just make a few sentences briefly. First, they were guest workers, as you're all maybe familiar with so many other nations, like mainly in Netherlands, Germany, of course. Then they became refugees, 1980s from Turkey, military coup, 1990s, the Gulf War in Iraq, because Kurds are not just in Turkey. I am from Turkey, but they're in Iraq, in Iran, and in Syria at the same time. So nowadays, we can say we have some skilled workers coming as well. After 2016, actually, we had so-called military coup in Turkey, and so many intellectuals had to flee as well. So nowadays, I read some articles about Germany saying that, oh, you don't look like Turkish. Like Germans say this to the Kurds coming from Turkey, because they always consider Kurds or Turks looking like guest workers' children or refugees at the same time. But that's another study topic. So Rojda is from Sweden, and she's a director, filmmaker. She's very successful. She has a few series on Netflix. So I'm not going to get into details about her films or short films, etc. But why I just picked her is because actually she has very good insights about being a woman and also a Alevi Kurd in Sweden. And although Sweden is the best country, by the way, in terms of, no, I don't know, I think it's the same for many, I mean, not any longer, not since 2015, but till 2015, because she was born and grew up there. So she had the chance of learning Kurdish, and she was embraced with her identity. But of course, she has had so many racist experience at the same time. That's why she says she particularly choose big cities. That's the same case with all the women I met. They always live in Berlin or Hamburg, at least, you know, the capital, so that they feel safer. And also, why she's so interesting is because she speaks Swedish. All her films are Swedish, apart from just one of them, but she somehow thinks that they find a way to see her work as a refugee art, that she doesn't like being labeled, because we're going to come to that discussion if they produce all these productions as an act of resistance. No, actually, she just wants to be a filmmaker. I mean, but she happens to be a Kurdish, she happens to be a migrant. That's the thing. But of course, you can't just say that and leave it behind and go on making films, and it doesn't work like that. And it didn't work with her. Because why she's interesting, because the first time I met her was 2020. And then I met her in 2018, and then 2021, I can vividly say that she has changed dramatically. She was, I don't want to say she was apolitical, but she wasn't into politics. But the more Turkey interfered Syria, she became more political. So she became more pro-Kobani resistance. And she wasn't talking about any of this, but she said she couldn't stop it because she felt so guilty for just promoting her own films, her Swedish films, and just leave her Kurdish identity behind. So it's some kind of sense of guilt, sense of responsibility. So it's not just like resistance, you know, activism. It's not that much political, actually. It's just like maybe human instinct as well, because we all feel guilty. I mean, after what's going on in Palestine, I mean, we can't be just normally enjoy our life and just be the same person. I mean, it doesn't work like that. So same case with Rojda, although she's Kurdish. And just one quote from her. She says she made a very, very Swedish, white Swedish film. It's thought that, so no, and then before that, actually, she made a film about refugee girls. So her parents are very educated. She had very privileged family background, let's say. But still, it's thought that I created the character of the white Swede and her father, the immigrant Kurd, who had served a time in prison, inspired by myself. So they believe that they did mean the media, let's say. We can't come up with a fictional product from scratch. A Swedish director is never asked if it is based on his own life and experiences when creating a Swedish male character. So she finds the film industry a very hard sector for everyone, but much, much harder for non-white women. Indeed, a luxury sector for second or third generation women of migrant background. Of course, we're going to talk more, so I'm just going to come to Germany. So she was actually just kind of an artist in the beginning, and then she became writer, and then she became a director in a few years' time. So I don't know how to describe her, but whatever she does, of course, success is very controversial term, but at least let's say she has been acknowledged by different platforms at the same time. But of course, I should mention that when these people are getting these awards, there's also this critic as well saying that you're not getting this award because you're good at it, because they have to pick one refugee or maybe one migrant to give that award, and this is just you. Because of your exotic identity, you get this award. So this is something that Cemile has had a lot, because all of a sudden she was very good. She gets fundings, and she can easily get published. So, but Germany is very, very tricky because they don't have just issues with German authorities, but they have issues with Turks as well. Because, for instance, she hid her Kurdish, not Kurdish identity, but when they migrated to Germany so that she wouldn't get attacked by Turkish migrants or guest workers' children, whatever, in Germany, because she said, if I told them I came in 1990s, because she wasn't born in Germany, they would have thought that I'm a refugee child. That means PKK-linked organization, etc. And then I will be the target of Turkish nationalists in Germany. That's why she said all her life, she said she's a child of guest worker, so that there is nothing political in my background, etc. But it has changed again. As I said, I've been following these women for a few years. So it's not like they say this now and it's going to be like that forever. No, next year, a civil war can, break out, and then they might just pick just political themes for their art. So I could easily see that. With Cemile, she said she was very shy about her identity, but she was pushed to produce in that line because she was, by the way, yeah, there is this Turkish lobbying is very strong, and Kurds are very intimidated by them in Germany. So for instance, she publishes a book, and it's basically about Turkey, but she doesn't want to name it Turkey so that she wouldn't get the attack. So there is censorship in German, and the book is in German. Publication is, publishing house in Germany, but she's scared of Turkish nationalists as well. So they have this fear at the same time, different from other European countries, because we don't have it in France. In France, we have Turkish spies issue. You might know, like 3 women were killed in 2013 by some Turkish spies. And also in 2021, 3 of them were killed by right-wing French. But still, we can't say there's a strong clash between Turkish and, oh my God. Yeah, okay. So Cemile says, she said that German politics often refuse to accept it. Yeah, Germany doesn't accept you the way your ethnic background, but where the country that you're from. So basically, she says, or all other German Kurdish people say, they always felt minority within minority because they are Kurd, but they were considered or they were registered as Turkish. And that's why she says, I always underline my Kurdish in my art, in my discourses. But Kurdish people are always invisible in Germany. And if you like Kurdish, if you are like a Kurdish living between those migrant communities, you are like, you really don't exist. So just one more. Okay, we have France. So in France, as I said, she's just one of women that I picked. I don't have any specific reason, but because she's first generation, and we also always we don't consider what kind of, I mean, we do consider, but they kind of feel they wasted years for being very involved in political activism as well, because again, that sense of guilt is more dominant with first generation, because it takes years for them to learn the language, and then instead of going to school or maybe focus on your own art, they feel like they have to go to the streets for the rallies, for the demonstrations, because it's very individual, what they call it, like passion to go after your art. So that's a dilemma that Esma has been having. So she's like almost 60 and she finally set up her own YouTube channel. So it took that long to do so because she thought she's Kurdish, so she's in diaspora, so she has to be very political to defend Kurdish rights because she has this tool. But of course, it's not that much easy because they have been actually criminalized by French or by German police or security officers as well. It's not like in the past. So just a few sentences about Tarajov. She's a musician from UK. She has a different story to tell. She accepts. She says, if I had, sang in English, if I just addressed English audience, I would have been more successful. But then I felt bad and guilty about doing that because I have never had the chance of embracing my Kurdish identity, because she was born in Baghdad and very, like they call it, prestigious family. And English was her first language, etc. So she says that I explored my Kurdish identity through Kurdish folk songs, which started a personal choice and passion, which became a professional passion. I have been distant to my Kurdish background and have never lived in Kurdistan, so singing in Kurdish became a means to explore my identity and have a bond to connect with my Kurdish identity. It was a personal choice, not a professional choice. So they had this dilemma all the time. So just a few things, then I'm gonna be done. So I can just say overall, because this one became a book, 40 women, it's not easy, but I can't help it, but I have to overgeneralize, otherwise I will be lost, you will be lost. Just a few sentences, then I'm gonna be done. So basically what I can say, their works are usually categorized as ethnic art, but both ordering and dimming the focus on their inherent aesthetic quality. So this is not a compliment, and they're not happy with it. And but as I said, Kurdish artist productions, but still serve a site of resistance because they somehow challenge the dominant political and cultural hegemonies. And but as I said, the sense of Kurdish identity can get stronger in time due to specific experiences. They always tell me that day that happened, and then I realized why I'm not doing anything about Kurdish issue. So personal choice can come much later. So I can easily say that, lastly, doing politics is much easier than doing art in Europe for these women, because, as I said, they have been politicized all their lives, and this European institutions, or this, I don't know, even the civil society, they see them as very political entities, and it's very hard to break it, as they say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Özlem. We'll have the chance to come back to your presentation maybe in the discussion section with a little bit more detail. And I leave the floor without further ado to Ruba.
That's right. Let me just check if it works with.
Thank you for organizing this really rich and informative panels and having all these discussions, by the way. So take your time. Not on a hurry. There you go. I'm just gonna do some kind of and test. Yeah. So welcome, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you today as a cultural anthropologist interested in performing arts from a transnational perspective. I focus on the experiences of migrant artists in Europe, including Syrian and Palestinian artists. In one part of my presentation, I offer an understanding of how artists negotiate the concept of home during the creative processes they engaged in at European theater spaces in the cities where they arrived. In the second part of the presentation, I will focus on migrants' means of negotiating the concept of home during the 21st century renewed genocide on Palestinians. As a theater practitioner myself, I demonstrate my means of constructing a home abroad through performing arts. The context of my research journey revolves around the transformative political moments. The first is the 2015 wave of artists joining the migrating masses from the Arab region. The second is the revolutionary change in the European policies and solidarities frameworks, which was seen later as threatening to the fortress of Europe's establishment. And the third is the 2023 renewed genocide of Palestinians and their feelings of the failure of humanity as a result of it. And lastly, the recent and sudden 2024 fall of the Syrian regime. These factors affected and still affect the concept and practice of citizenship in Europe, integration discourses, and artist subjectivities. One of the recent implications of this context is the complicity and silencing of Palestinian defenders and academics and the violation of international law. The presentation's main question is how the relational dynamics of these creative processes influence artists' transnational opportunities for homemaking in Europe. My investigation focused on a grounded analytical approach, inducing an understanding of artist homemaking trajectories and how performing arts help construct the concepts of choices and memory. Before I start, I would like to share with you a segment of a performing artwork titled Dreams of Migrant Woman by Mainz in 2018. She collected dreams from a huge number of ladies who spoke about their dreams and shared them, and then she turned them into a performing art. I think you can. No, I'm moving. You can. Yeah, it's a video. Please, this one. Yeah. It has sound if you want to. Supposed to be a dream. It's okay, you can try it. In various locations of the theater space, there were spots of dreams of women. I can see really harsh material, which represents and speaks about a lot. In the past decade, many theaters hosting creative processes in Europe have explored including migrants' experiences within their performance genesis and methodologies. And they considered their inclusion to help preserve artists' social and cultural capital from one side and integrate them within these theater institutions from the other. However, on the other hand, these institutions canceled recently Palestinian performances or performances dealing with Palestinian issues, and many bluntly spoke against Palestinians' right for life. In my study, I conclude that while creative processes enabled spaces for reconstructing concepts, they were not able to support artists' free will, their subjectivities, I mean, in the philosophical aspect. These theater institutions too were not able to keep hosting these artists due to language restrictions, rigid theater culture, and weak structural diversity from frameworks within them. This means that it was intended as a structural integration, yet was never achieved. Plus, they are agenda-driven when it comes to the Palestinian issue. Before the COVID-19 pandemic broke and global lockdowns were practiced, we could see a proliferation of theater on migration. These are ads from websites or newspapers about performances organized. However, the COVID-19 crisis uncovered other priorities of the theater scene, such as the digitization issue and the multimedia practices, and migrant theater was barely one of those priorities. We could barely see productions of this kind, especially in Germany. My research delved into defining two trajectories of homemaking, the trajectory of identification with the transnational reality and the trajectory of entanglement with home. For this presentation, I focus on the first one, which enabled me to induce patterns and arguments that artists made about their trajectories throughout the process, the creative process where they did improvisation, and broadly about their life experiences in Europe. And here I'm proposing an example from a creative process moment, which I wrote in my observation notes, where migrant artists were improvising on the concept of home. I have induced patterns that artists experienced, which explain relational associations to both technical and thematic elements of the creative processes. And these relational connections are the space where artists made their choices and decisions, and they introduced their thinking processes. So it's supposed to be an innovative open space. From here, we can say that artists drove these creative processes, which I believe comprised repeated patterns. Let's read. Here, a conversation between a Syrian artist, Kamel, now I can reveal his name, and a German artist, her name is Maya. Kamel was describing his studio in the European city, which is Munich now, as a simple, clean, and neat room. It looks more like a dream Then, like a reality, I try not to miss with its neatness. Maya suggests, why don't you put pictures of your room in Damascus in it? Camel, my room in Damascus is full of piles of things, CDs, books, and a drawer here, a bed where I sleep deep and have dreams. So I like to sit in it to prepare myself to enter my dream or a third world that is not Sham, Damascus, nor the city. That's why I'm telling you about this room. This is part of the improvisation they did. So what are the patterns that I found? For now, I will present two patterns. The left side, which is the experiential pattern, and the right one is the dialogical. I can come to conclude that artists in several improvisation processes in documentary theater projects in Europe use those creative processes, use techniques in them which focus on a past experience where they propose an intimate space around a memory, and they propose then to create an experience around it with peers on stage during rehearsal, and then share it publicly through making a connection between it and between something common in the transnational space. In Kamel's case here, we can see that the bed, for example, is one of those everyday things. I also concluded that in the process of sharing their stories, narrating, a dialogical pattern appears where an artist describes a personal experience, physically mimics it alone or with others, and then brings opportunity to pose question about it to allow interaction in the space, bringing an opportunity for making choices in describing home or a familiar space and so on. As a result of constant repetition of these patterns I observed through observing many creative processes, the artist's documentary theater enables identification with the transnational reality when discussing home through practicing expansion of their memories and enabling choices about the means of sharing them. From here, choices enabled Kamel with an agency, opening his space to a new meaning possibilities, such as the third world that he suggested, turning his choices into a home negotiation tool in Europe. Now let's move from choices to memories. What we see in what Kamel says here in the same segment is that the transnational reality enabled a space for recreating memory. Memory recall enabled Kamel with another agency, opening its boundaries of the memory to other spatial possibilities. This converses with what Ruba Saleh once wrote, that the recall of material memories is engaged with the internal experience of rupture that invites a constant negotiation between the past landscapes and present territories of citizenship. So here, narration patterns utilized memory to engage and expand places and turning memory too into a home negotiation tool during their experience in Europe. Memory in this case is described as a personal, cultural, and emotional homemaking tool utilized to negotiate what is domestic during the creative process. Now I turn to the second part of the presentation, where I focus on migrants' means of negotiating the concept of home during the 21st century renewed genocide of Palestinians. Let us illuminate this other context of a transnational reality and touch upon some of its homemaking processes. Here's a segment from a performative practice in 2024, unsupported by theater institutions, in the same city as the first segment, and it was produced by a group of activists. Let's read. That's my notes. The woman, who was standing in a visual like in the same city square, says to one of the two propped-in nurses, "I am afraid these tiny pieces will soak under the rain." One answers, "This will add to its realness." After that, she moves into the center of the half circle formed by the two quarters and lights the candles. The candles surround mock coven bodies lying on the ground. We stood waiting for a crowd to create so the visual would begin. Some passers stop for a moment to watch us. Drops of water started splashing our faces. We look at each other and see a painful smile, then tighten our feet on the ground. I told myself that if people don't show up, we do it alone. Vigil is a vigil with 5 or 50 supporters. That's what my father used to say. I stared. My father, what brought him to my mind now? What brought 11th grade at high school to my mind now? The memory of a theater scene he directed came to my mind. In it, friends and family held a young man shot while refusing to leave his land, being confiscated by colonizers. In the segment I'm reflecting on now, my witnessing moments of the mass killing appears. I find my witness as a dramatic portrayal of a genocidal performance, where the culture of those subjected to it is resistive. Through this reflection, I engaged in the many layers of witnessing I have encountered so far to understand how the spectatorship of a 21st century genocide and beyond is constructed, and how it provides a performative archive that transcends the violence of media acts of the genocide against Palestinians. As I wrote those moments, I portrayed myself as a performer and as a spectator of this genocidal medium and an integral part of it. My spectatorship and interaction are in turn watched by second-degree spectators. In this case, they are my people in Palestine and people around me in the diaspora and you, who, by reading these moments of witness, probably imagine my witness closer to a dramatic scenes. I find my writing of my witness necessary to dramatize the action of empathic connection among all performers and spectators of this genocide. It does so by defining layers of movement within the structure of the genocide and by so allowing further layers of its interpretation. My choice of the reflective points I produce within the witness moments is essential to my witness, and the dialogues, monologues, and non-verbal connections I observe are crucial to it. Together, they form subjective and collective processing of current experiences and re-memory within the genocidal medium. They mainly provide patterns of self-defense, anxiety, sumud, and the will to tell a story among many other patterns, like we saw with Kamel. These patterns are integral to the lifetime experience of Palestinians, no matter where they are. And my writing expresses my thoughts about these patterns as conscious and unconscious repetitions. They are unconscious because they unintentionally explain specific arbitrary moments where these patterns appear in the life of the Palestinians. They are also conscious because thinking about them while writing them connects with previous moments and similar patterns, like remembering my father. These moments could be lived by hundreds of thousands others than myself. By doing so, writing enabled these patterns to formulate a meaning for a resistance significant to my subjective and collective identity. The more witnesses I and others experience and reflect upon, the more meanings for resistance are regenerated. As such, choices and memories, here in my case, were instrumentalized in the witness to construct home under genocide as a medium identified by layers of experiencing, witnessing, where the humanity of Palestinians in and outside Palestine and non-Palestinians in a transnational reality is that of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruba, and I'll leave the floor directly to Dima, and afterwards we start with the discussion.
I often find myself coming back to this picture of Yadan Daraji whenever I write or present work on Our Memory Belongs to Us. It was taken shortly after he left Syria on foot through the Jordanian border. It was the first stop in his journey from eyewitness videographer to refugee, migrant, exiled. We can pick the concept, the box that we can fit him in from our European definitions. I'm wondering, as I present this work to you today, if he's been returned to Syria since the topple of Bashar al-Assad returned, and have in some ways picked up the revolutionary moment exactly where they left it off, in the same public spaces, to the same songs that they protested against Bashar al-Assad in over 14 years ago. It's precisely in between these temporal and spatial expressions of being and belonging that I'd like us to think or rethink the relation between creative archiving practices and processes of memory making and identity building in times of revolution and of war. Rami, who's the filmmaker of the film I'm talking about and who's in the audience today. So we decided any questions about Exile, I'll take. Any question about Return, he'll take during the Q&A. I hope there's more questions about Return than about Exile, in the spirit of forward thinking as well. So he's been back. This picture was taken only in January with Houda, who's one of the 3 surviving characters, filmmakers of the film I'm talking about today. And this was taken in Daraa. But allow me, for the context, to take you back about 14 years in history to when Meedan and 3 of his friends, the 3 surviving ones, spent the first 18 months of the uprising recording hundreds of live footage and protests, activist gathering, bomb attacks, funerals, testimonies. And when he fled Syria on foot, he smuggled a hard drive, which became known as L'Hard, that he entrusted his friend Rami with. It sort of took us about 7-8 years to make the film. I make 2 children faster than a film. So you can imagine how hard and long the journey of making something that makes sense. The result was Our Memory Belongs to Us, a 90-minute documentary film, which premiered in Copenhagen International Festival in 2022, and it's still touring the world of human rights festivals. So the drive, the material comprises 12,756 video sequences, totaling 2 terabytes, of which 3,482 for the sake of history, it's important to specify, and it's in about 400 hours of footage. I was fortunate to be invited by my friend to join the crew as researchers and activists, and there's a lot to say about, I was then a researcher at university, so there's a lot to say about our own positionality, as well as exiled. I'm Lebanese, in exile. He's Syrian. Everybody is not in their home country, and we're trying to engage with these stories. In 2020, Rami reunited Meedan and his 2 surviving friends on a theater stage, which I think is really, you have so much to talk about, in Paris. And specifically, why theater? Because Rami, sorry to speak to you in 3rd person, is a performance dancer, and we chose a space that was like suspended in time, where nothing's happening and where you can make up anything you want inside of it. And then out of the 12,756 videos, we chose intentionally 26 videos that we showed them. And then the film is about filming their interactions and their reactions to these archives, sort of a decade after then. So my presentation here today will be in 2 parts. First, I will attempt to describe the migrant journey of the Daraa archive, from an eyewitness documentation of the early days of the uprising to a collection of digital files on a hard drive in Paris to a 90-minute film documentary that is touring the world of human rights festivals. So the film in itself is a product of exile. This part is concerned with the effects of the democratization of image production and dissemination on the ways our societies bear witness and remember. Then I'd like to share with you initial findings from a larger project, the Syrian Oral Memory Project, or History Project, which I started working on a few years ago with my also exiled friend Abdurrahman Jalloud, who lives in Sweden, and through which we're documenting the experiences of 100 Syrian image makers from Damascus, Daraa, Hama, Homs, Aleppo, and Raqqa. And I sort of became obsessed with the project. So this project is not funded by anybody. It's not for academic research. It's my own, our own sort of little madness. But the idea is we're talking to the same people over 10 years. So we're not doing one interview and being like, see you soon. It's about talking to the same people about archival practice, about the value of their archive, and trying to understand how the reaction to their own images is changing as the situation is unfolding. And this part is concerned with what Pinchevsky called the democratization of the archivization of memory to explore the mnemonic potential of crowdsourced archive produced in times of conflict. So first question that we ask ourselves when we started working with Yedan's material, what should we call it? Is it a collection? Is it an archive in the making? Not formed, but in transition, seeking roots, but founded in an origin of trauma and displacement. Or maybe a migrant archive seeking fixity, or a nation state, like the activist who shot it, but with a history to speak for. So this, the Declaration of the Revolution is one of the first videos saved on the hard drive. It's just over 30 seconds. Can I put the sound? There's probably not a better time to be revisiting the first moment than now. So a preacher lifted on the shoulders of two men speaking into a megaphone when the crowd rumbles and unite voices, revolution, 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 5 times, 10 times. We understand from the title of the file that this moment marks the first public declaration of the Syrian Revolution, March 2011. And it's kind of a very special moment to be sort of involved in. So does a citizen-generated sequence of the first public declaration of the Syrian uprising constitute a historical record of the Syrian uprising, and who gets to decide? Important here are both the general issues around the archive, its definition and impact, and the specificity of this material and its meaning, and its collection, production, process of collation, its travel, and the duration of its transmutation from live witness to historical material awaiting engagement and use is a challenge to its very important impact. When we asked him in 2016 about his source of inspiration to take to the streets, also, as we were making the film, we were constantly interviewing Yedan, right? So there's like this ongoing conversation. And because it took 9 years to make, there's plenty of time to actually change our opinion and for him to change his mind about what was happening. But he said the long years of oppression in Syria, the protests in Tunisia, the coverage is all got. But when I asked him about his own motivation to film, he said he understood very quickly that he was witnessing a very important moment, a historic moment, and wanting to document this moment in the history of his people inside of the country and outside it. So it's really interesting that very, very early on, while Syrians were still at the very early days of their protests, they were already talking to the Syrians who are not in Syria. We'll come back to it. It's apparent then that their primary motivation in recording the events was not accidental but purposeful. It was to say, this is happening now, like this to us. Such an intolerable situation demands a response, and the moral economy of contemporary vicarious witness afforded by mass media and the ubiquity of social media means that it's no longer possible to claim ignorance of the events. Yet we did. As such, the Dara record underlines the immediacy with which a response was needed. And I'm arguing that, as we discussed this morning, the Syrians in exile, such as Rami Farah, have become these custodians of these homemade archives and have taken on themselves to create these pathways for political, social, and cultural engagement with these records, because peoples in Syria could not do it. Sorry, closer. Sure. Do you want me to start from the beginning now? Before I turn to the relation between war archives and memory, I'd like to suggest an answer to the question I asked at the beginning of my talk. How should we name the Dara material? I want to call it a refugee archive, a collection of records in the process of becoming something more fixed, official, and usable. It's an archive in the making, an idea which alludes to its status as well as the experience of those who compiled its materials and who transported it. In this, the makers and their material share a condition with those it depicts and who were forced to migrate, not in search of a better life, but simply in order to just stay alive. The work on the Daraa archive, so I'm going to move to the second part of my presentation today. The work on the Daraa archive has led me to start thinking about the relation between the images made by Syrian survivors and processes of collective memory making. So we started the document with my friend and co-founder of the Syrian archive, Abdurrahman Jalloud, oral testimonies of Syrians inside Syria and in exile, who documented the revolution and subsequent wars since 2011. The unearthing of these individual memories and narratives allow us to investigate the meanings of what we are calling a Syrian digital memory of the 2011 uprising. We want to interview 100 image makers, and I mentioned the cities. There's a reason why these cities, we can have this conversation later. And we just want to take them and we're going to make them into an open access repositories of these oral testimonies throughout the years. We've interviewed 40 people to this date, but we spoke to each one of these 40 people more than 40 times. As such, the Digital Memory Project's aims are twofold. First, it stems from a desire to address one of the main shortcomings, and I'm going to see it in the mic, of the debates currently taking place in the West on the need to sustain and better organize crowdsourced content from Syria. While this content is seen as the only viable documentation of human rights abuses in the Syrian conflict and its value recognized for its potential contribution to transitional justice and post-war reconciliation, these conversations tend to happen for the most part on behalf of the Syrian photographers and videographers instead of directly engaging with them. And I can't believe I'm saying this today in 2024. But yes, we are. Second, and probably more importantly, the project advocates for the recognitions of Syrians in Syria and in exiles as survival of a genocidal war waged by a dictator against his own population, thus making the collection of these oral testimonies an essential step in the rehumanization of the narrative of Syrian conflict and post-war reconciliation effort. And the literature on Holocaust studies is so rich there. There's so much for us Arab to learn from. This is from an interview with a guy I love so much. He's called Hakawati. Well, he calls himself Hakawati, which for those who speak Arabic understand the joke there. So we asked him to tell us about Hama, and he said, I was 4 years old. It's a very long interview, so I'm cutting it out. I was 4 years old. I don't know much about Hama. I only know what my mother and my grandmother told me. My father never spoke about the massacre. I never asked. I'm convinced there are things I remember seeing with my own eyes, but maybe I have made some of them up as well from the stories I've heard. The people of Hama call it the Valley of Anguish. I don't know if the name only stuck to it after the massacre, but until the 2011 revolution, I always thought of Hama as a city of mourning. My grandmother used to say that during 27 days of the massacre, she thought the same thing as was happening elsewhere in Syria. She lost 5 kids, all her 5 sons. She thought the same death was shared by all Syrians. It somehow made it easier. It was only after she went back to Aleppo a few years later and she started to talk about it to people that she realized it was only in Hama. She never left her house after then, and she died in 2008. Barely any tangible trace beside the testimonies of those who survived remains today of the Hama massacre. A few pictures of the destroyed neighborhood surfaced online in 2012, but their origin and the authors remain unknown. There's only visual records of the assault by Hair Sector and the 27 siege imposed by the Syrian army over the city. There's no consensus over how many people died either. The Hama massacre has somehow slipped through the remnant of Syria's contemporary archival memory, and this probably explains the obsession with Hama, which overshadows the conversation we started with literally every single Syrian who live in exile. Any conversation you start with Syrians in exile, the first thing they'll say is Hama. But despite its omnipresence, Hama was not the first reason they started to film. As Hakawati put it, it was happening too fast. We could only think of what we were experiencing right here in the present. But as time went by, the hauntings of the massacre found their way into the narrative that Syrian photographer and videographer make of the record today in exile. A revenge over history, they say, so that 1982 never happens again. The role of the archives in our society's ability to remember and luckily to forget at different stages of development across history has been the subject of quite a lot of really interesting work. In Archive, Media, and Trauma, I really like this piece of work by Amit Binchevsky. He argues that considering audiovisual archives as a medium of memory has the potential to offer very valuable insight in how we can challenge how we engage with the past and also the future. The relation he draws between memory and archiving as a collective practice is at the heart of this digital memory project, thus making crowdsourced audiovisual content of people in exile a key vehicle for the mediation of a Syrian collective memory and its constitution and preservation over time and space. So I'm going to take just 2 minutes quickly to outline the main motivations that we so far have highlighted or identified from as to why. So the interviews are organized different parts. First parts, we ask a lot of questions about what they filmed with, where the cameras came from, how they used them, how they smuggled in, etc. The second part is very much concerned with why they filmed, right? So all the motivation. And this is the part that we constantly come back to. And I'm really excited. We've got like 10 interviews lined up next week. And these are the first we're going to be doing since December the 8th. So it's a really special moment of people obsessed with Syrian archives to be talking about people who archived 15 years ago. And the third part is concerned with preservation and where they keep their archive, how they smuggled them out, how they lost them, what they lost, can they remember, etc. So in Evidence of Me, Sume Kamish argues that record keeping is a kind of witnessing, a way of evidencing, memorializing our lives, our existence, our activities and experiences, our relationships with others, our identity, our place in the world. The testimonial value of their archives as the only surviving record of those who were lost in the war is a common thread to all the conversations we had with our Syrian respondent in exile. These archives are also space-bound. They are the last remaining documentations of cities and neighborhoods which have been wiped out by the war. So we had people talk about how archives can survive what people in cities are likely to succumb to. One of the Mohammed Zaidan, there's like also the whole shift of finally you can name people. We all like to see pictures of neighborhoods in Syria in 1910, 1920. This is why the content is important as a testimony to our cities and to immortalize our memories. If people die, pictures stay. If cities are bombed, videos survive. I'm going to move quickly. We don't have to have the voice and sound. So this, I'm going to go back to Dara. So this is a video that Meedan had shot, and he hid, for those who have seen the film, he hides the camera. You can roll the film if that's okay, and then it doesn't have to, it's very long. He hides the camera in a napkin box and puts it in the front of his car and just drives around. Nothing happens. He's just driving around the city. And in one of the interviews we're having to them, I asked him, like, of all your things you shot, what is like the most significant, the most important piece of image that you made? And he was in Paris when we did the interview, and he said Dar al Balad, this is what the video is called, and it's just because he said this is, I can watch it again and say this is where the baker was, this is where the playground was, and literally you'd imagine it's like some like a inspiring image that Europe wants you to say of like a protest of women at the forefront, but actually no, it's just like a random video of him driving a car around the city that he loves. In his foreword to the English edition of Pierre Norat's seminal work, Realms of Memory, Ernst Kurtzman writes that Norat's work not only demonstrates the relation between memory and the creation of social identities, but also dramatizes how one's consciousness of the past is symptomatic of the disappearance of certain living conditions. As such, the creations of Realms of Memory, or lieu de mémoire, is the result of the absence of real memory and our society's inability to live within it. There are realms of memory because real environments of memory have disappeared. Lieux de mémoire exist because there are no longer any milieu de mémoire, settings in which memory is a real part of everyday experience. One could argue, and this is an argument I'm making in an article that came out recently, that by becoming the only record of loved ones and hometowns which have been wiped out by the war, the crowdsourced archives of Syria that form the basis of this project and Yadan's archive have become les lieux de mémoire, where Syrians' memorial heritage is being negotiated and therefore formed. In considering the relation between media and memory processes, Kaiser argues that using digital media to document abuses and record individual memories in search for truth or for social justice are great examples of popular communication being used to frame human rights conflicts. She talks about memory media in the service of human rights to attest for the way in which media could be used as a trigger for reflexive action against abuses and violations of power. The potential of their crowdsourced archive to be used as evidence against the Syrian regime and to hold it to account for its crimes in the years to come thus became one of the main motivations behind Syrian photographers documenting the uprising. Ahmad Ramadan has been collecting footage from Syria for over 15 years. Some of it he shot himself before he slept Deir ez-Zor and when the Islamic State took over his city and killed his family. Later on, he fled to Turkey and started working through his media collection. He created something called the Furat Post, and then he had become Deir ez-Zor Slaughter Silently. I think people here have probably heard about it. Since then, his work has become focused on archive. He set up from Turkey the Al-Furat Anti-Violence and Terrorism Center, which is focused on sustaining development, women and children, most importantly, the trial of war crimes in Syria. Artino is another photographer. He's a freelance photographer who's been in exile since 2016. He's covered the chemical attack on Eastern Ghouta for Reuters and then left. He doesn't necessarily believe in transition justice, but he does believe in the power of the Syrian eyewitnesses to push for these images to bring about justice. Since I started documenting the revolution, I was hoping my picture would be used to put him on trial to face his crimes. I always keep thinking of the picture with Stop the War in Vietnam. I look at the picture and say, when will my pictures do that? But really interestingly is that the distinction between Syrians who are in Syria and Syrians in exile, how they speak about this idea of post-war reconciliation and transition justice is completely different. Syrians in Syria have zero hope or any belief in any idea of transitional justice. And they will tell you, like, you watch us being slaughtered on live TV and nothing happens. Syrians in exile have, and this is the argument we make in the piece, is that they've internalized very Western paradigms of post-war reconciliation. You won't hear any Syrians in Syria say post-war reconciliation. I don't even know what it is in Arabic. Does it have a synonym? Does it have a synonym? But here, like, you speak to Syrians here, it's like transitional justice. And I'm like, seriously? And then you have to dig really deep for like half an hour. So there's something really interesting happening with also when we spend 15 years here, we start talking like people here. A joke, but only you laugh. Thank you. Finally, creative justice, creative value. In addition to seeing themselves as the custodian of the narrative of the Syrian revolution, the photographer and videographer also highlight significance of their archive for what could be considered as a creative memory of the uprising. This brings to mind Keitel and Pickering's complex concept of mnemonic imagination. Looking at the relation between creative memory and painful pasts, they explain that some past can resist creative remembering and suggest looking at the concept of mnemonic imagination as a way to engage consciously with those sources of pain that continue to haunt us in our present life. They argue that by engaging creatively with some elements of our painful pasts, memory can become a creative resource again, thus reducing, if not actually annulling, the pain of the past and enabling us to turn towards the future in a less daunted fashion. We were talking this morning and I brought up this idea of what are we doing for our research questions to be more survivor-centered, to avoid re-traumatization and objectivation. About 50% of the people we were earlier connected to didn't want to talk. They were like, do not tell us, do not ask us to revisit moments that are actually really painful. We want to forget. We made it here. We just want to be French. We just want to be German. We don't want to remember. So we got to make space for that as well. Artino started to document the uprising in Eastern Ghouta as an independent journalist before joining Reuters and becoming one of his most prominent war photographers. He recalls, and it's the same question I tend to ask a lot to the people I speak to, is like, what is your most important film? Like, of everything you shot, what is the one that stands out? And so Artino speaks about the very first YouTube channel he set up when he was still in Ghouta, and he sustained as he was in exile, in his mother's hometown, a neighborhood where a community of Circassians lived. He started to make short films which document everyday lives of elders who have family members elsewhere in the diaspora in the world, and who did not know how to connect with them because their grandparents didn't have social media. So he set up a YouTube account and will go to just weddings and film people in weddings and put them on YouTube. And people across the world will just go on the YouTube channel and just watch weddings, and they'll be like, this is my granddad, that's my uncle, and that's my aunt. And I find this just amazing, right? So like, this is the one project he says that and the guy became like Reuters. He won awards of like war photographers. It's one of the projects I'm most proud of. I have made movies of weddings. The city was under siege and I was filming Circassian weddings with people dancing. That is why I created a YouTube channel. It has nothing to do with anything, but it's just the most important part of our collective memory. We asked Hakawati what he thought had happened to the memory of Hama and its 1982 massacre, and he said, it died with my grandmother. And I said, what about Aleppo? He was living in Aleppo then. Actually, no, he had left. He was in Paris, yeah. It's here in our heart, on our hard drives, on YouTube, on social media, it's everywhere. It's being both, though, used, institutionalized and instrumentalized by Western media to serve their own agenda. How do we take it all back from Al Jazeera? The only way to properly preserve it is to actually involve those who have created it. This work advocates for better engagement with the crowdsourced archives produced by these people in Syria and in exile. Most of them are around us. Let's just talk to them instead of talking about them. The contribution of this, the acknowledgement of their contribution of vernacular accounts in the writing of a history of this conflict challenges us as media and archivist scholars and as historians alike to consider how to represent such material in the archive proper through meaningful conversations and collaborations between all of our disciplines. But perhaps more importantly, this work also recognizes the need for academic research to engage in more proactive conversation beyond academia, to engage with those who collected this archive and who live in our cities, and with all the stakeholders involved in the aggregation, verification, and preservation of this material. Despite the challenges this represents, and I understand in terms of access, but also in terms of funding, but this is the only way for memory and media studies scholars and historians to critically attend to the question of the political economy of digital cultural memory. The only way for you guys to be able to do it is to do it with them. Thank you. With them. Sure, Fadal.
Thank you, Houda. Thank you, Özlem. Thank you also to Ruba and Dima, and also to Rami to be with us today. We'll take the questions in a couple of minutes, but maybe we had a wee discussion to prepare our panel, and there were a couple of issues actually that emerged and over which we wanted to come back in a couple of minutes. A first question that I would like to address maybe more directly to Houda. Houda, are you still with us? Oh, Houda is no longer with us. She is?
Yes,
okay.
I am with you. Just
okay. Yeah, great. So first question to Houda and also to Dima, because it connects well to what you just mentioned, goes directly to well, social media and filmmaking, because both of you have addressed this. They are intrinsically linked to the practices sometimes of archiving and also to oral history. And I wanted you to elaborate a little bit further, Houda, on how Libyan, but also you, Dima, on how Syrian diaspora communities have contributed also to shaping and to forming this history from abroad, and not just, as you said, talk directly to people on the ground, but what's the impact also of the diaspora communities on this material directly. So I'll leave maybe the mic to you. Houda, maybe you want to start?
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you, Isabel, for the question. I think social media has played a big role actually in the Libyan revolution, and even after with the civil war, because this is how Libyans were able, to get their country back to international scene, away from the image of Libya being this Jamahiriya, of Gaddafi that was for at least 2 decades, internationally isolated. And so those Libyan exiled, whether in the UK or in Western Europe in general, but also in North America and also in countries such as Egypt and Tunisia, were sending videos, for example, of the uprisings, whether in cities such as Zawiya, which was at the time, bearing the brunt of Gaddafi's, bombing, but also cities like Benghazi and Misrata, where during the beginning of the Libyan uprising against Muammar Gaddafi. Also, after the Libyan revolution, there are a few podcasts that have mushroomed and in the Libyan diaspora, especially in the UK. And I mentioned earlier, the Damira podcast, which is considered probably as the most prominent, podcast right now, because they were this podcast was able to democratize, let's say, the story of Libya to a larger audience, whether the history of Libya through oral history, mainly through novelists such as Hisham Matar, or even, for example, Libyan political scientist Ali Hameda, who through actual oral history wrote a book about genocide in Libya that was committed by the Italians. So by inviting all these Libyan activists, but also artists, singers, Libyan singers, living abroad, he was able, Tariq Al-Miri, who was the host of this podcast, was able to bring the history of Libya through this oral history of those artists or novelists, but also even the art of Libya, whether through singers, and bring Libya back to the normal, because it has never been normal as a normal country because of the way the Gaddafi has totally closed it off to the outside world.
Thank you, Houda. I pass over to Dima.
Feel free to contribute. There's something very interesting about how different the Syrian situation model was to Egypt and Tunisia as well, right? Because when Egypt and Tunisia happened, we just imagined that content will just fly out of Syria and it inunded our TVs and mainstream and social media, and it didn't for different reasons. There was, other than the excessive repression that we hadn't seen anywhere else, there was problems of internet infrastructure, of access to technology, but also literacy. People had lived under Ba'ath for 40 years, and that has got very huge repercussions in their access to alternative media platforms and their knowledge of how to use them. So the Syrian exile, the diaspora community, played in plural, played a very important role in taking that content and putting it out to the world, and then as the years went, making sense of it, as in turning it into movies, into theater pieces, into art performances, into whatever ways of social, political, cultural engagement with that context. I mean, how many people here spent, I don't know, we spent hours on Skype chat rooms? Does everybody remember? Do you guys remember Skype? Is anybody old enough to remember Skype? Okay, great. So this is where people uploaded. So I know you spent hours of your life sitting, waiting for the video to download so that you had it, so you could do something with it. So it was, when we say the Syrian exile became the custodians of these videos that often people lost their lives literally. I'm not trying to be over dramatic in making. And then the survivor guilt that Thomas, I think you mentioned this morning, meant that I'm not there. The least I can do from being here is making sure that content is downloaded, is preserved, and is something done with it. So in terms of engagement with this crowdsourced footage, it changed as time, because it took so long. No one was expecting it to last this long, obviously. And then no one was expecting it to happen so quick last month either. But Syria's got this magic about doing things. I'm not sure without the exiled Syrians, we would know as much as we know right now about what had happened in Syria. Can you Do you want to add anything?
No.
For the other questions, Wami. Okay. The second question would go to Ruba and also to Özlem. Özlem, you've talked in your presentation a little bit about this dilemma of artists, of diaspora artists, not being recognized as artists per se, but oftentimes finding themselves labeled as activists or resistant. I was wondering whether, Ruba, you have something in common here, and to what extent the different types of performances both of you have looked at are simple acts of resistance, or whether they are more than that, and if so, how would you describe that?
I wish I had very simple answer to that question. As I said, it really depends on who the person is, when we're talking about the generation, the country at the same time. But I can just tell you that, as I mentioned, they really, I mean, first generation, yes. I mean, I can say that. I consider myself as first generation. Like, when I came to London, I was like 24 or something, and my mom once told others when I was there that Özlem became Kurdish in London. I didn't really understand what she meant by that until now, because I think when you're first generation, when you come to Europe, of course, maybe right now it's much more tricky, but in like 2016, when I first arrived, things were much different in the UK. We had, as Kurds, we had much more freedom. Turkey less involved. We didn't have Conservative Party over like a decade back then. So like we had all these opportunities to learn Kurdish or to attend. We had like London Kurdish Festival. We don't even have any Kurdish festival where I was born. So basically, automatically, you're just embraced by all these opportunities, and then you're just hooked by all of these, and then you just question, okay, I know the language, what can I do for that? That's why I switched from literature to Kurdish literature just in a few months. I've been just assimilated and became Kurdish in a few months. So first generation, I can say that's the case, maybe, but for the second generation, no, that's not the case. They really want to exist as an artist, whatever they do, but it's not that much easy, either for internal reasons, for external reasons. They do that for a while and then they had to switch. But especially because we're talking about after 2011, I think I have to mention how important this Syrian war on Kurdish diaspora in terms of acknowledging their own Kurdish identity. I can easily say that Kurdish politics is very fragmented by so many Kurdish political parties. So we are not united. There is one Kurdistan, but we have lots of political parties. But it was the first time Kurds from Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, they were all united for Syria, for Syrian Kurds. And then all of a sudden we start to see second generation women, even males, they started to internalize their Kurdish identity and project that on their artistic productions. So I can say that it's actually, yeah, I think I can say it has become more political, more act of resistance with the influence of the civil war that also I have to mention there are just I don't know how many million of Kurds in Syria, but that's the least population, but it has very symbolic significance for Kurds worldwide. Thank
you. Regarding the issue of resistance, home, and performance, I think these are things to engage with first internally as a person, our subjectivities, as I was trying to say, our longing for a free will, you know? And when we say resistance, and looking at it from the perspective of the inside of one person, it ceases to be something that is used in media discourses or in whatever context that is now condemned mostly, you know. But when it's a process of looking inside how patterns of our lives are repeating itself one by the other. And when we realize that we are not practicing through performances a cultural resistance, it becomes something that is inside us. The way we dress, the way we speak, it becomes a culture of resistance rather than cultural resistance. So I think it's more about the subjective, because before it goes beyond to be something that is collective. And during theater practices, it's always a process of thinking the process and then articulating and narrating it. And thinking it makes it yours, and then narrating it makes it shared with others. So that's how I look at it. I answered the question.
Thank you, Ruba. And maybe one last question to all of you before opening the floor. It is something that actually popped up from our discussion that we had earlier, that the engagement of diaspora with their homeland, with their identity, is inherently tied to the notions of return and belonging, and the imaginary also that they have about what does it mean to return home, what is home. And we said that in the Syrian context, it compels us actually for a re-examination of those ideas. Because as Dima, you have mentioned it in our Zoom discussion, have the Syrians truly left? Does their connection transcend actually the physical departure? And also the question of what is the role that the Syrian diaspora, but also other diasporas, can actually play in supporting also their country's transition? And equally important is probably also to ask for us the question, what risks are also emerging when diaspora communities kind of project their vision from afar to what's going on actually on the ground. So I wanted you to reflect a little bit on this latter point, and I think, Rami, you might have things to say here as well.
Hi, thank you so much for your question. Actually, this year I experienced two kind of return. Originally, I'm from Golan Heights, which is occupied by Israel in 1967. So now I have a French nationality, so I had the chance to get back through Palestine with my wife, who she is Palestinian, and go to Golan Heights to see the village where my parents came from. So I can count it as the first return. The second return, which has happened just 3 weeks ago, I went back to Damascus, where I born, and here I want to talk about the collective memory and what does it mean memory for me as a person when I am in this spot in Damascus or in Golan Heights. Because in Golan Heights, I breastfeed from my parents. What does it mean that's the homeland, or why we belong to Golan? But when I was in my village, I know nothing there. I was just a stranger. And even there is a people who they are living in my village. I had the questions like, how does they feel about me? Am I the strangers there? Who are they? In Damascus, when I went back like 3 weeks ago, I have a memories, which since 14 years, I was out of Syria, 13 years. I think I cut out part of my memories to survive, to keep alive. But when I was there in Damascus, one of the accidents happened with me that there was a car from Idlib with the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. 4 armed men inside the car stopped next to me and opened the window, and they asked me like how we can go to the mayor square, ساحة المحافظة. So I felt more and more how I belong to the space, because I know how to tell them, like, you have to go in that way, then get that. Even with their arms and their cars and their four-wheels cars, I belong to that place. I born there. I know what does it mean to be there. Um, can I-
Yeah, sorry, I'll go ahead. No. Maybe they're intelligent. I'm just gonna keep it very brief. I guess we're always having this like a binary like opposition between staying and then returning. Of course, it's gonna sound very intellectual, very elitist point of looking at things. What if we just go and then come back and then go and then come back? Because I mean, I wish that could have been possible, because I know there are lots of people who wouldn't like to leave what they have established here at the same time they want to go there. And so, I mean, of course, as I said, that won't be the same or accessible for everyone, but I wish there would be more collaborative work between here and then there, between, you know, the civil organizations and NGOs, etc., because that would be really much more fruitful. For instance, like I know Zehra Doğan, the artist that I mentioned earlier, like she really wants to set up her own studio in Syrian Kurdistan, and then trying to, I don't know, train artists or who want to be artists at the same time. I don't think like she wants to settle there, but she just wants to be there for a few months and then offer whatever she has and then maybe come back at the same time. So I think we should be looking at alternative way of being in touch with our home country and also be present here, because this has become our home at the same time, to me at least. Not France, of course.
I was just gonna say that some we have to remind ourselves, especially in like Syria or Egypt situation, somebody who's 25 today in Europe left when he was or she was 11, and then they became the people they are. They're doing undergraduate in this and this university, or like they became the people they are in Europe. And so I bet the return, and thanks to the Palestinian, like for as a Lebanese, we've been haunted, we've been breastfed the idea of return from Palestine. Like Arabs have got this like obsession with this idea of returning, and I think we should chill out. We should just allow people to take the time to explore. Nadim, you're saying this morning, none of them took one-way tickets. Obviously, like, why would you? Of course, I mean, it took so long to build the life here. So even just to imagine that they can just return as if they haven't been putting their lives and souls into making a life and friends and homes and safety. Absolutely. Yeah.
What type of government?
Yeah. So I think we need to try and resist the urge to do with return the same that we've done with migration as a concept, with diaspora as a concept, with, that's what I'm suggesting.
If I may say something really shortly, I don't think that, okay, so liminality studies, Houda knows, many might know, and also transnational, that there's no go back when you go out. It's not no go back to the place. They did it. They returned, and I hope others would return too. The thing is that when you go out, you cross this liminal border, and then going back would never be the same as leaving. So that's the thing. It's thinking about home as something progressive towards the future, not thinking about it as something rooted in its tradition, you know, and its rigid understanding. So of course, people change when they go, and there's no go back to where I was when I left. I don't know if that happened to you.
Actually, for me, it's a healing process to confront myself, to confront my life, my past life. My daughter is French. I have to go back, to come back to France. She's French. So it's about me, my own self. I mean, like, so to re grab or to healing. Actually, the healing may be the right word.
I think it's interesting what Rami just said. My daughter is French, because when we had the discussion in preparation of this panel, this idea of the younger generation and now comes back is really an issue. I mean, today you have in Syria young people that don't even speak Arabic. You have a number of young people that are fully Turkish speaking without any notion of Arabic, or French speaking without any notion of Arabic. So this is also a question of how can you feel you belong to this country when you don't even speak its language and can't even, connect with the culture and so on and so forth. It's a therapy, yeah. Well, anyways, if there are any questions in the room, we are taking them. So I have to, and there's also a question over Zoom. Oh, sorry, Houda. Houda, you want to talk?
Yeah, just on the idea of return, because I discussed earlier, the book of Hisham Mattar, The Return, because it definitely epitomizes this battle, Sisyphean battle of wanting to return but not being able to return, living in this liminal space for most Libyan in exile. Have they really return to their home countries as they left it, and also an issue of also with the identity of their children, because some of them they are half Libyan, so the issue of language, and how they have become estranged, from a country that they have never known. I just wanted to add one more a quote from Sharif al-Himish, whose mother is British and his father is Hassan al-Himish, who is the most famous Libyan cartoonist, who lived in Libya, Satur, which means the cleaver in Arabic. And he was talking about, he wrote a very beautiful article for New Alliance magazine about his father's, legacy as a cartoonist, as a form of resistance. He said, 8 years since his passing in 2018, I reflect on his advice and exile without return. Thank you.
Thank you, Houda. We'll take the questions from the audience.
So hello everyone. So my name is Lisa. When I hear everybody talk, something is funny for me, but it's not in real funny because it's an issue. So I'm an immigrant girl. I was born in Algeria. And when you talk a stranger, like as a person, my personal experience is that I grew up here in France. I came here when I was 5 years old, and I grew up as a stranger. Like here is my home. I'm a French citizen with the French nationality, but when I am here as a student, we tell me that I'm an Algerian. So when I success, I'm a French, but when I failed, I'm an Algerian girl. And when I come back to Algeria for summer, we said to me that no, you are French now. You sound typically Occidental in everything. And my question is, with your personal experience with this notion, because like I'm writing poetry and I'm studying law, and I think I'm the only foreigner of my class, and we are just like 17 in the whole room of my class. And sometimes when I show how I wrote poetry or when we have debates, they have this specific habit to say like, oh, it's a political agreement. I doesn't want to share like a political opinion, but it's just because like I'm who I am, but because they think that I'm an immigrant and they saw me as that, but I'm French citizen and I am French because I have this nationality. They tell me, so, oh, you do social media as the place of commitment when I share something about war in Syria before, or war in Palestine, or when I'm talking with the professors, they tell me, oh, you are just too much when you talk to them about history or everything like this. And I just want to have like your advices into life and your personal experience about this notion of homeland to be just like who we are in those countries who welcomed us. Thank you for.
Maybe we can take 3 questions and then I let you answer.
Thank you for a really wonderful and moving panel. My question is to Özlem. Actually, I have 2 questions. So you started with kind of the image of 2 women up on the screen. And I think you'd mentioned that it was kind of a Western portrayal of, in the media, women fighters in northeastern Syria. But also there are political actors who have kind of been pushing that image and using it and so forth in some Kurdish political actors. So I'm wondering about the tension in terms of that kind of politicization and its impact. And then I was also struck that I think two of the artists self-identified as Alevi Kurdish, and that seemed to me a certain positionality, within the Kurdish community. So I was wondering how many of the artists also self-identified as Alevi.
Thank you. Great panel as well. I have a question for Ruba and another for Dima and Rami. So my question for Ruba, again, great project. I am moved. I am also an anthropologist, and one of the, I worked a bit sometimes with a translator, and I tried to find some methodological anthropological work that about noticing and observing the craft itself and how it develops, and I almost didn't find. And so my question is for you about your experience as a field worker, working with those artists, working with those performers, and how you were developing your practice over time somehow with them, since it's a unique positionality. My question for Rami and and Dima. First, one point about return. I think we need to problematize the idea of return more, about asking who's returning or from where and when. Already we're talking about more than 300,000 Syrians who already returned from Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. And they are the most probably the people who will be quote unquote returning in the future, because if you go to Syria from Beirut, you will find in the way somehow people who are living still in camps, people who are living still in tents, and they are not living actually in these countries. And the minority of Syrian refugees are actually in Europe. So when we are talking about returning in about this category or this population is a completely different theme, while talking about it from the perspective of other Syrian refugees. I have been in Syria. I just returned 4 days ago, and I also didn't take a flight or a return ticket, as you're saying. And that's my first question is about, so the photographer that you worked with, are all of them have been all of them in exile, or some of them stayed in Syria? Or if they are in exile, where you mentioned, I think France and Germany, all over. So I'm asking because I'm curious about the difference in narratives between their photographic experiences or video taking, etc. Especially that when you are in certain places, you gain certain political and cultural and artistic capital, and actually when you return, you never return the same. You return with these capitals, and I am sure that, for example, I don't know, artists or Syrian artists who are in Egypt or photographer, not artists, are completely different, a bit different from the people who are in Paris or whatever. So these differences. My last question is about So you said you're thinking about putting it in as a crowdsource archive, as a free access. I'm very curious if you have already any steps, especially for me as an observer, the Syrian archive movement or non-movement is just incredible, starting from individual normal people to Kaiser footages. So I'm curious to know how you're thinking about this, especially there are some institutional memory archive attempts, like the Syrian memory by the Arab Center in Doha, or individual ones like مجموعة أبو نضارة, if you are aware of them. So how you are mm, trying to put what you have been working on within all this discursive field, if we can say. Thank you. And great, of course.
Can we take one more question, or we can answer?
Oh, okay. Lisa, I'm not going to give you again. I'm not a person who can give just straight answer anyway, but I think we don't have to choose. I mean, we don't have to explain where is our home. Actually, it can also change. Like for me, for someone who has been living outside Turkey or Kurdistan, let's say, but I grew up in Turkish side actually. Sometimes I feel like my home is just at my bedroom. Sometimes it's just specific city. So I'm not bothered with choosing either or. And also, but still, I would advise you not to stop explaining because simply they don't know. I mean, simply maybe they are the things they only know. But this is something very common that actually Kurdish women poets have told me. I'm just going to give one example from Sweden. Aroza Arif, she's from the Hawk, Iraqi Kurdistan, and she came to Sweden when she was like 1 year old. And she's very Swedish with the language, with the publication, etc. And then she published a poetry collection, and she has nothing to do with migration or exile or war, trauma, etc. And then she got a few awards with that for that book, and she has been interviewed by journalists. And I wrote about her, and I published in English actually, like. Once a journalist just asked her, like tells her actually, when I read your poetry, they all remind me the Persian Athena Farukzad, or Swedish Turkish Burcu Şahin, or Danish Palestinian Yahya Hassan, And then, so what do you think about that? So the journalist asks and gives all this migrant background poets. And then she says they're all very different from each other, first of all. And the only thing they're in common is just they're all migrants and they live in Europe. But we all write on different topics and we have different literary approaches. Yes, I write about family, violence, but so does American poet Sylvia Plath. You can't compare me with anyone, but you prefer to compare me with people whom I have nothing in common with creatively, thematically, and aesthetically. I brought up a different reference to Swedish poet Marta Tikkanen, who published a poetry compilation in 1970, writing about her abusive relationship with her husband. I asked her if she read things and if it reminded her of my work. She said she read it, but she didn't think of me. And she's like Arozo says, but this is very interesting as my poetry is more relevant to her work. So actually you're gonna come across such, I don't want to say judgments, but comments, but you shouldn't stop explaining because I'm sure you might change what they think, that you might change their opinion. And just very briefly, as a response to Fiona's two questions. First of all, I should really mention when I showed you two portrayals, like especially women fighters and maybe political activists, I should say that this is my opinion. So I'm not going to say that all the Kurds feel the same way I do. I mean, there are so many Kurds. I think I'm maybe one of the few people who is very bothered with these images, because I know even my family members, they're so proud of seeing all these Kurdish women fighters, and they don't see the marginalization here. But what I'm trying to say, of course, not everyone has to be a poet or writer or an artist, but we should see the agency of women everywhere. That's why actually I wrote an article about my hometown, how women are very strong, housewives, not educated. I feel like they're the boss of their house. You know, like, I mean, I'm sure Arabs will say the same thing. Don't you think that your mothers are, in many terms, are stronger than your dads, actually? They are most of the time, isn't it? Like this, yeah, decision maker. I'm scared of my mom more than my dad, actually. But somehow the Western scholarship doesn't say so. All these, Middle Eastern women are disempowered, and we're just very scared women. But that's not the case. So that's why I just want to say that we have to look at the agency in ordinary life as well. But of course, I'm not full. The lack of funding. Nobody will fund any research like this, because we know that the Western powers will just fund those researchers which are actually contributing to marginalization of Middle Eastern people, like, as I said, other killings or war or conflicts, or they just want to understand Middle Eastern people. But actually, as I said, it's just very, very stereotyping images, just reproducing itself all the time. Sorry, hopefully. Oh, and then one more, yeah, just very briefly. It's a very small one. Alevi Kurds. Yes, the majority of Kurdish diaspora actually Alevi Kurds, but not necessarily they say two of them next to each other. Some of them say I am Alevi, and they don't even mention that they are Kurdish, because because Kurdish people can be quite religious, and they don't want to identify themselves with Sunni Kurds. That's why they want to pronounce their Alevi identity at the same time. But this is also changing. Since 2011, as I said, we see that all these identity transitions at the same time, or at least they kind of express more openly. Thank you.
Houda, maybe you want to react on that? I see that you raised your hand.
Yes, sure. I just wanted to react to answer one of the questions of the panelists, of the participants who was from Algeria, Algeria, France, whatever. I think there's a country that there's so many similarities bear similarities with Libya, is that of Algeria. Historically, both countries have been shaped by the traumas of colonization. Both countries were French and Italian colonies, respectively, with one more or less reconciling with the former colonizer Libya, in the case of Italians, because there was some kind of transaction between, at the time, Gaddafi and the Berlusconis of Italy to recognize the colonization of Libya as a crime against humanity, which is not the case for France. And so the generation of the second and third generation of Algerians and French, with they have there's some resemblance, they bear some resemblance to the generation of Libyan exiles who left Libya because of Gaddafi's repression in 1969 and afterwards, the 1970s and 80s. And a lot of them, they lost their identity as Libyans, especially the ones whose mothers are not Libyans, whether they're British or Irish or American. And they came to be called double shafra, which means in Libya, double SIM card, because, they're neither Libyan nor Western or whatever. And so they always been longing, for this idea of return, like this obsession, and I've got the chance when I was to live in Libya between 2012 and 2014 to meet with some of these mixed, race, if I can call it, children or of, Libyan fathers, whether they're Libyan American or Libyan Canadian or Libyan Irish. Libyan British, and their obsession of going back to the homeland of their fathers, because their fathers had never known, that homeland, because they had to leave. They left, for example, Libya when they were 20, and the country has changed dramatically. I remember one that I met, who was actually engaged, even in the Libyan revolution, fighting with Libyan revolutionaries, to topple Gaddafi. And his mother is American, and he's now settled in Libya, and he doesn't want to go back to the US because he feels that, he had to, compensate of what his father lost, that homeland, and his father lives in the US still. And so this kind of, loss of identity, loss of the homeland, is something that I also noticed when I used to live in the UK with the French Algerians, or French Algerians of French ancestry, who a lot of them, they had to seek, refuge, quote unquote, in London because France was becoming unbearable. And so this kind of double and triple exile will always shift their identity. Shape their identity, and I think it's important, to embrace that, that complex identity as what makes, these French Algerian or Libyan British or whatever, as part and parcel of how they were able to innovate and to becoming those creative artists, these wonderful singers and novelists who lived, to tell the story of their countries, of whether their homeland or their country, their exile or their second their other homeland, whether in Europe or elsewhere.
Thanks for that. Maybe very briefly, if you can answer very briefly the question that
I was going to suggest we answer questions over the coffee break.
You can. It's just for the people on Zoom. They can't listen to it. So if you can just make it very brief, the answer to Saeed's question, and then we can have a
brief answers to your question, Saeed. I'm really sorry. You had an answer.
I'll answer you over break as well.
I just want to say one sentence. Can we please not make it sound like we're discovering neocolonialism as well? Like it's been our lives for so long. It's almost like, I'm sorry, you're Algerian, you live in France. To be honest, but to be honest, I mean, the conversations about the issues of representation when we are in one of the biggest colonies of contemporary histories is also, it is what it is, and we have to fight against it, and that's how we get on. Thank you for a long time.
All right, I'll take this as a closing statement for this panel. Very engaging, but well, I invite you to take a coffee and to continue our discussions over coffee. Thanks.